was from NYU, the Curran Institute for Mathematical Sciences. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto in Illinois, and probably went on to Oceanic, where he spent since 2010. And he's been working in the climate group there. His bachelor's was in mathematics and physics, and obviously the Curran Institute is a very mathematically oriented place, but sort of unusually for someone with specific background in mathematics who's done a fair amount of field work. He's been out in fjords in Greenland multiple times, and he's been out on the Canada Glacier in Antarctica. But that's not what you're going to be talking a little bit about ice.
Not with ice, but not those projects.
But not those projects. But the current work that he's going to be talking about now has to do with the predictability of ice and sea ice reemergence. And it involves both looking at data in an interesting way, but also a very novel and seems to be very powerful new method for analyzing that data. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of taste of both factors in this. So he'll be here for lunch after the seminar, and take it away.
Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So thanks a lot, Christopher, for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the invite. Got a chance to meet a few of you already, and I'm around all afternoon, so if you want to chat, I've got a fairly full schedule, but maybe you can find me at lunch. We can find some time at some point to chat. Okay, so the title of my talk is Arctic Sea Ice Reemergence, the Role of Large-Scale Oceanic and Atmospheric Variability. And just before I start, I'd like to say a thank you to Dimitri Giannakis and Andy Maida, who have been supervising this project. Okay, so this talk is going to be all about sea ice, and I'll start by giving a brief motivation of why we care about Arctic sea ice. And then I'll get into this really interesting phenomenon known as sea ice reemergence. That's going to be the main basis for the talk. A main tool I'm going to use in this talk is something I've been working on developing over my PhD, which is a technique called the coupled NLSA method. NLSA stands for Nonlinear Laplacian Spectral Analysis method. So I'll quickly describe the method, and then I'll show you the spatiotemporal modes that we get using the method. And then the interesting part, for me anyways, is the implications that these modes have in terms of understanding sea ice reemergence and the possible physical mechanisms by which reemergence happens. And then I'll conclude. Oh, pointer, yeah, thank you. Okay, so Arctic sea ice is one of the hot topics in climate science right now, and a main reason for that is because it's one of the most rapidly changing pieces of the climate system. So this is a pretty well-known graph here on the left, and what we're looking at here is September monthly sea ice, the average monthly sea ice extent for September over the satellite record. So this is the time series from 1979 to the present, and it's a really remarkable signal. There's a really strong negative trend. So we have roughly half the sea ice that we had when we began the satellite record. And on the right here is just the spatial pattern of a typical sea ice extent. So in the orange line here is the median sea ice extent for the years 79 to 2000, and then plotted in white is the record minimum sea ice year, which happened in 2012, and the spatial pattern corresponding to that. So you can see in 2012 it was something like half of the extent. So these are really, really big changes that are obvious to anybody looking at these pictures. Now, there's more than just the trend going on, though. So if you look at the trend, there's a negative trend of roughly 14% per decade, or minus 1.4% per year. But if you take this curve here and you detrend it, and then you just look at the ratio of the standard deviation to the mean of the sea ice extent, that number is about 8%. So what that tells you is that there's a lot of interannual variability. And on a 1-year or a 2 or 3 year scale, it's probably the internal variability of the system that's going to dominate, and it's only over longer time scales that this big trend starts to take over. Okay, so because of these big trends, people are really interested in making accurate predictions of sea ice. And there's been a really nice piece of work recently by this group called the Search Sea Ice Outlook, And what they've done is they've solicited seasonal sea ice forecasts from groups all over the world. And these forecasts could be any type of forecast. So it could be a modeling approach, statistical approach, or even just like a heuristic, like sort of a rule of thumb type approach. So they'll take basically anything that people want to give them that has some sort of physical basis anyways. And they collect all the forecasts, pool them together, and then after the fact they compare those forecasts to the actual observations of sea ice. So the sort of gray band here is the different sea ice predictions from 2008 to 2013, and the gray band is the interquartile range. So this is the middle 50% of predictions. This is kind of the typical prediction you can think of it as. And then in red is the actual observed sea ice extent in all of these years. And what the Sea Ice Outlook group has found is that in years in which the sea ice extent lies close to the linear trend, so in particular 2008, 2010, and 2011, the predictions do quite well actually. They're quite close to the actual observed values. But in the years where there's a substantial deviation from the linear trend, so 2009, 12, and 13, the predictions miss by a lot. So in these years, almost all of the predictions lay outside the actual value. Okay, so aside from just making predictions, an interesting avenue which I've been looking into is trying to look at sea ice and the possible physical processes which could possibly buy you some predictability of sea ice. So if we want to make better predictions of sea ice, we'd like to know the pieces of the climate system that could endow sea ice with some predictability. And there's been some nice work done recently by Ed Blanchard-Wrigglesworth at University of Washington. And so this paper was published in 2011. And in the paper, he defined this concept called sea ice reemergence. And so when I say sea ice reemergence, I'm talking about a lagged correlation phenomenon. So what I mean by that is that sea ice anomalies now tend to be positively correlated with anomalies in the future, despite the fact that correlation disappears in some intervening time period. So to make that a bit more precise, like if you look at this plot C here, what we're looking at is lag correlations of May sea ice area with future sea ice area. And so if you look at the lag correlation, it starts at 1, because May correlated with itself is going to give you a correlation of 1. And then as you move into the summer months, you see this fairly rapid decay. It's a roughly exponential decay. And when you hit the summer, there's quite a low correlation value. And then at some lag in the future, you see the correlations jump up again right there. So it's that increase in correlation that we call the reemergence of correlation. And a priori, you wouldn't necessarily expect the correlation to jump back up again like that to some positive value. So this is saying that in May we had an anomaly, we forgot it essentially over the summer, and then the memory of that anomaly came back at some lag in the future. And so for the case of May, it comes back at a lag of about 7 or 8 months. In the case of March anomalies, it comes back at a lag of about 10 or 11 months. So the lag at which reemergence occurs is a function of the initial month that you start with. Okay. So this checkerboard plot, I'm going to be showing a lot of these in this talk, and this is a nice way to plot these reemergence curves for all months and for all initial months and all lags. Okay, so what we're looking at here is on the y-axis is all initial months going from January to December, and then on the x-axis I'm plotting all lags into the future from 0 months all the way up to 2 years. Okay, so for example, this March curve that we have right here, that corresponds to the third row in this checkerboard plot. So if you go on the third row, you can see I start at correlation of 1, I decorrelate, have correlation values near 0 over the summer months, and then I jump back up to a positive correlation at some lag in the future. Similarly for May, I decorrelate, 0, reemergence happens. So is that clear what this plot is showing? And so the feature we're really interested in is this group of positive correlations, which we call the summer limb. And it's really this signal that is the sea ice reemergence signal. So all these correlations here correspond to ice anomalies that began in the spring, were forgotten, which is this white band here, and then came back again as positive values. And there's also a slightly weaker limb down here, which BW calls the winter limb, which corresponds to anomalies originating in the fall and then reemerging the following summer. Okay. BW also suggested a nice mechanism for how the sea ice reemergence happens. And his mechanism involves a trade-off of anomalies between sea ice and sea surface temperatures. So here's a simple schematic of the mechanism he proposed. So it's supposed to be started in some spring month. So in the Arctic, the spring is the melt season for ice. So ice is starting to melt and move northward. And let's suppose that we start with some sort of positive anomaly in sea ice. And let's suppose that we have no anomaly in the ocean to begin with. Then the mechanism BW proposed is that as the ice melts and moves northward, it leaves an imprint on the ocean. And in particular, it imprints a negative ocean anomaly. Because if you have more ice than normal, you tend to have colder sea surface temperatures for two reasons. One, the ice is actually constraining the SSTs to be at the freezing point of water. And secondly, if you're covered in ice, you can't get the heat fluxes from the atmosphere that you would if you weren't ice covered. So for both those reasons, you'd expect there to be a positive anomaly in the sea surface temperatures. And then because the ocean has quite a high heat capacity, it's able to maintain that negative anomaly over the summer months. Then as we enter the fall, the ice starts to grow southward again, and it interacts with the negative anomaly in sea surface temperatures and grows additional ice relative to the climatology. So you get this reemergence of the positive anomaly again. Okay, so we'll come back to this a bit later in the talk. Okay, so now into my research. So the things that I want to try to add to this picture are, so one thing I didn't mention is that in BW's approach, he was looking only at the lag correlations of total sea ice area. So in other words, he was looking at the integral of all sea ice area and just looking at lag correlations of that. So in other words, there was no spatial information in what he was doing. So what we want to do is try to incorporate spatial information and study the regional characteristics of sea ice reemergence. And then the second main piece is to try to look at the different mechanisms for sea ice reemergence involving other pieces of the climate system potentially. And to do that, we're going to do a careful study of the modes of variability of sea ice and the ocean and the atmosphere. And so when I say ocean and atmosphere, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about sea surface temperatures and sea level pressure fields. And then the last thing we want to look into is studying the temporal characteristics of sea ice reemergence. So in other words, do sea ice anomalies reemerge every single year, or do they sort of pulse in time? What is their temporal structure? So we're going to try to look at that a little bit. And then a related question to this, which I'm not going to go too deep into in this talk, is I've been working on developing a data analysis algorithm which generalizes the NLSA technique for use on multivariate data sets. And I'm going to be using this algorithm to do this variability study. Okay, so just a quick word about the data sets in this talk. So there's going to be two main data sets. The first is a control run from a GCM integration, and so it's the NCAR CCSM 3 model, and it's a really nice control run because it's 900 years long. So it's a really nice time series to study the low frequency decadal variability of the ocean. And then the other data set we're going to be looking at is a mix of observations and reanalysis from HAT ISST and area interim reanalysis. Okay, and then here's just some details of the data sets, which I'll skip over. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do was to try to generalize BW's lag correlation approach to account for the spatial patterns of these sea ice anomalies. And so the recipe we came up for doing that was this recipe, which we call time lag pattern correlation. So the idea is that we would like to, instead of just looking at the integrated sea ice area, we'd like to look at how the sea ice area anomalies in a given month pattern correlate with the sea ice area anomalies in another month. Okay, so I'm going to define PC, which is a pattern correlation function. So what this does is it takes a spatial map of sea ice. So I've been saying area, but sea ice concentration and area are essentially the same thing. So sea ice concentration map. So it takes two of those in, and then it spits out a correlation between -1 and 1. Okay, and I'm going to be performing these pattern correlations using anomalies from the seasonal cycle. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is, for example, let's suppose that I want to do this time lag pattern correlation for initial month of January, let's say, and then lag 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go for each year, I'm going to look at my January sea ice anomaly field, and then I'm going to look at my February sea ice anomaly field, and I'm going to compute a pattern correlation, which gives me a number for that year. Then I'm going to do that for every year in my whole time series. That gives me a whole bunch of these pattern correlations. I'm going to take the mean of that, and then that's going to be the number I report as my time-lagged pattern correlation. Okay. Yep.
Do you take account of the trend when making these kinds of?
So that's a good point. So with the CCSM data, it's a control run, so there's no trend. And then for the observational data, I've actually detrended the data. And I should comment that I've detrended it by subtracting what I call the seasonal trend. So for each month, I compute the monthly trend and subtract that from the data set. Because the September trend is actually much bigger than the March trend, for example. Okay, so if you use this time-lag pattern correlation methodology, these are the results you get. So these are the same checkerboard plots we were seeing before. Now we have a bunch of them. So let's start with panel A. So panel A shows these time-lag pattern correlations for the CCSM3 data, and so this is over the whole Arctic domain. And we see a similar summer limb feature of positive correlations, and the winter limb has been significantly weakened, actually, with this pattern correlation approach. But nonetheless, there still is quite a clear reemergence signal in the data. And I should probably add that asking your data to have a high pattern correlation is a much more stringent test than just having the global integrated anomalies correlated. So the fact that this actually exists here is quite an interesting result, I think. And then a second interesting result is if you take the observational data set, which is panel B here, you actually get extremely similar lag correlation structures between the model and the observations. So this is one of the rare cases where actually models and observations agree pretty well.
Can you
yeah.
Can you tell us what the different patterns are, because we can read it from?
Yeah. Sorry, this text is really small. So okay. So the top panels are for the whole Arctic domain, and so we see a good agreement in the lag correlation of those top two panels. And then the bottom 5 panels are for these different regions shown here. So the second row is for the Bering Sea, the third row is for the Sea of Okhotsk. And so if you compare the model to the observations, you see that there's a really nice reemergence signal in the North Pacific in the model, but it's essentially absent in the observations. So there's a big difference on the regional scale here. Row 5 here is the Labrador Sea, which is this domain, Labrador Sea and Baffin Bay. And in the model, there's actually no sea ice reemergence limb, but there's a really strong summer limb in the observations. So what looks like a really nice match over the whole Arctic, when you go to the regional scale, you see actually substantial differences between the model and the observations. And then in the Barents-Kara Sea, north of Scandinavia, they both have a fairly strong summer limb, and also in the Greenland Sea as well. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move on, and I'm going to give a brief summary of the data analysis techniques that we're going to be using for this study. So the coupled NLSA method, it kind of unites two different ideas. The first idea is the idea of time-lagged embedding from singular spectrum analysis. And the second idea is the idea of Laplacian eigenmaps from machine learning. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about singular spectrum analysis, or SSA. Okay, so the setting is, let's suppose we have some scalar field x. So let's suppose that you can think of this as like ocean temperatures, for example, and that's defined at n spatial grid points. And we collect an S-sample time series of my variable x. Okay, so the typical data analysis technique in AOS is EOF analysis. So in EOF, you would take this time series and you would break it up into a bunch of spatial patterns, which are sort of like the ingredients of your signal. And then each of those spatial patterns comes with a time series or a principal component. And that time series tells you, at a given time, how active or inactive is that spatial pattern. So it's a way of decomposing your signal into a bunch of different modes. SSA is similar, except that instead of spatial patterns and temporal patterns, you're breaking your signal up into spatiotemporal patterns and temporal patterns. Okay, so what I mean by that is we're going to choose some time lag Q, and we're going to basically try to produce a bunch of spatiotemporal patterns which consist of Q snapshots of my field. And then each of those spatiotemporal patterns is going to come attached with a principal component describing its activity as a function of time. And SSA is nice relative to EOF analysis because it can capture things that EOF can't. So in particular, if you have a propagating signal, SSA can capture that with a single mode, whereas EOF you would need a whole subspace of modes. And in general, EOF don't do very well even with a subspace.
So
Yep.
This is what we call extended EOF?
It's the same as extended EOF. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And another positive feature of SSA is that it's also able to effectively separate timescales in your data. So in climate data, you have periodic variability, you have low-frequency variability, potentially other types, and SSA is able to separate those quite clearly into different modes. Whereas EOF, the principal components tend to contain power at many, many different timescales. Okay, so the way that SSA works is you construct these lagged embedding vectors, which I'm calling capital X sub t. And the way we do that is we take the sample at time t, and then we stack below that the next q minus 1 samples. So this vector now consists of q snapshots of my field, q snapshots of sea surface temperature. And then I'm going to build a data matrix capital X, which just has these lagged embedding vectors along its columns. So this data matrix X has dimension n times q rows, and then it has s minus q plus 1 columns. So this is lagged embedding space, and this is time. Okay. And then just like EOF, we're going to take our data matrix, and we're going to perform a singular value decomposition of that data matrix. So we're going to write it as U sigma V transpose, where U and V are orthogonal matrices. And the columns of U are my extended EOS. So these are my Q snapshot spatiotemporal patterns, and the columns of V are my principal components, or my temporal patterns. Okay, so that's SSA. NLSA is a little bit complicated, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the full detail of it. I'd like to talk about it after if anybody's interested, or in the question period. But what I have here is sort of the NLSA algorithm as a black box, roughly. So what we're going to start with is our data matrix and lagged embedding space, same as SSA. So in SSA, we would just do the SVD of this and we'd be done. NLSA, what we're first going to do is, using our data, we're going to compute a set of natural basis functions for our data. And what these basis functions are the Laplacian eigenfunctions on our data space. Okay, so a nice way to think about these is sort of like Fourier components. If my data all lived in the interval, closed interval 0, 1, these eigenfunctions would just be harmonics, they'd be sine waves. They'd be higher harmonics of the sine wave. And then the idea is that we're going to use these modes to basically filter our data. So just like if you have a noisy time series and you project onto the first L Fourier modes, for example, to smooth it out, we're going to do the same thing with our data. And we're going to use these Laplacian eigenfunctions, which is sort of like a generalization of a Fourier mode. And but these eigenfunctions are trained on our data manifold. Okay, and then the actual output of our algorithm is we're going to get, just like SSA, we're going to get a whole set of spatiotemporal patterns, and each of those comes attached to it a principal component. Okay. So I should mention that this algorithm was developed in the chaos group over the last few years by Dimitri Giannakis and Andy Maida. And then when I started working with Dimitri and Andy, I started working on developing a modification of this algorithm called coupled NLSA. So the idea is to generalize the NLSA algorithm to allow analysis of multiple variables with, in general, different physical units. So that's kind of a challenging problem in the sense that how do you compare SST, which is in Kelvin, sea level pressure, which is in pascals, and CS concentration, which is in percent. So somehow you have to find a way to take the units out of the game, and we have a way to do that, which I'd be happy to talk about in the question period. So just as a black box, so what we're going to take into our algorithm are the lagged embedding data matrices for ICE, SST, and SLP, and then the outputs are, for each variable we get a set of spatiotemporal patterns and a set of principal components. Okay. So here's an example of the temporal patterns that we see for ICE. So the first column is a snapshot of is a piece of the time series of the principal component. The second column is the autocorrelation function, and the third column is the power spectrum. So the first two rows correspond to periodic modes. So the time series are sinusoidal, and the power spectrum is a clear peak at some frequency. So the first mode is the annual cycle, and the second mode is the semi-annual periodic mode. If you go a bit deeper into the mode spectrum, you start seeing low-frequency modes appearing. So the rows 3 and 4 here are examples of low-frequency modes, and these modes are characterized by significant power at subannual timescales, and most of their power is actually at decadal timescales. And if you look at the autocorrelation function of these modes, it tends to decay slowly to 0 with a decay time of roughly 2 or 3 years, typically. Okay, so if you did SSA, actually, you would get all these modes. The one thing you don't get with SSA, or at least as cleanly as NLSA, are these types of modes. And we call these modes intermittent type modes. So we call them intermittent because they tend to be characterized by a sort of bursting behavior. So they have some base frequency of oscillation, and then they seem to be modulated by some sort of lower frequency modulation, some lower frequency oscillation. And if you look at their power spectrum, they tend to be based upon some certain frequency, but they're broadband about that frequency. And then in terms of their autocorrelation characteristics, they tend to look kind of like a damped oscillator. So they're oscillating, but they're also decaying away to 0. Yep.
So this is a technical question. So how many snapshots do you stack?
Oh yes, yeah, I should have mentioned that. So in this case, we're using 24. So the data we're using is monthly average, so it's 2 years, exactly. Okay, so these low frequency modes are very closely aligned with what you would see with EOF analysis in terms of their spatial pattern. So what I'm plotting here is the first EOF of CA concentration, and then this is a certain snapshot out of my Q snapshots from my leading low frequency NLSA mode. And you can see that the patterns are very similar between the two. Again, the pattern correlation is 0.98. So this mode has a similar spatial structure to the leading EOF. Where it differs is actually in its temporal behavior. So the way the mode turns on and off is going to be different than the way that this principal component turns on and off. Okay. Similarly for SST, we see a similar match between the EOF and the leading low frequency mode from NLSA, and same with SLT. So the leading low frequency mode resembles the Arctic oscillation, and the second low frequency mode, it's not as perfect a fit, but this is the EOF here, and this is the NLSA mode, and this SLP pattern looks quite close to what people have recently started calling the Arctic dipole anomaly, and it's characterized by a sea level pressure gradient between Europe and Russia, and North America and Greenland. And so if you think about the winds associated with this mode, they're primarily meridional, blowing either from the North Pacific to the North Atlantic or vice versa. Whereas the Arctic oscillation, the winds are primarily zonal. So it's an interesting mode in that it provides a way for sort of physical tracers to get from lower latitudes to higher latitudes or vice versa. Okay, so we have all these modes, but who cares? What are we going to do with them? So the game we decided to play was we wanted to investigate Ice Reemergence using our NLSA modes. So this plot A is the one I showed before. So again, this is time lag pattern correlations for all months and all lags of the year. And the question we asked is it possible to find a small set of NLSA modes that are able to qualitatively reproduce the lag correlation structure that we see in the raw data? And if so, how small can we make that subset? So in other words, I want to try to find the minimal possible subset which is able to give lag correlations that look somewhat like the raw data. Okay, so I did that, and it was basically a combinatorial problem with some intuition involved. But if you do that, you can find this family of NLSA modes consisting of 3 modes. So this family, which I'm calling F1M, consists of a low-frequency mode, an annual intermittent mode, and a semi-annual intermittent mode. If you do a spatial reconstruction using those three modes, and then do the time-lag pattern correlations, you get the plot we see in D. Okay, so the correlations, first of all, they're much higher than the raw data, but we'd expect that because we're using just a three-dimensional subspace here. So these modes just don't have time to decorrelate nearly as fast as the full noisy raw data set does. Nonetheless, even though we only have three modes, we can see that there's a clear decorrelation, loss of correlation, and then recorrelation in the data. So just like there's a summer limb here, there seems to be a strong summer limb here as well with this mode family. Okay, and a sanity check that we did was we took, so it's possible that maybe we just chose some set of modes which by fluke had this lag correlation structure, but it's possible that maybe these modes actually aren't the modes that capture the variance which is producing this signal in the raw data. So the way we checked that was we did lagged correlations, but now lagged cross correlations. So here we're doing lag correlations between the raw data and the NLSA mode family, with the NLSA modes leading, and here we're doing the same thing with the NLSA modes lagging. And what we see is when we do the cross correlations, actually, panels B and C look qualitatively very similar to panel A, actually, which seems to tell me that the variance captured by these modes in panel D seems to be the same piece of the signal that's producing the reemergence in the raw data. Okay, so you can do the same thing with the observations. Oh, I should mention that there's also a weaker second family of modes in CCSM3, and if you do the cross correlations, you see a hint of a summer limb, but it's not as strong as what we saw in the previous figure. And then you can do the same thing with the observations as well. And again, there's a three-mode family that exists, and its cross correlations are not perfect, but they have certainly a strong hint of this summer limb in them. Okay, so I've only been talking about sea ice so far in terms of these modes, but it turns out that each sea ice principal component, it can be associated directly with a certain SST and SLT principal component. And by associated, I mean highly correlated in time. So if you just do a correlation, they're highly correlated. So I can basically build a spatial pattern corresponding to my mode family for sea ice, and then I can build a corresponding spatial pattern for SST and also for SLT. So if I do that, we actually gain some interesting intuition about the possible mechanisms for sea ice reemergence. Okay. All right, so what we're looking at here in the top left is the reconstruction using the reconstruction of my ice mode family, and then here's the associated SST family and the associated SLT family of these ice modes. Okay, so let's start off with the ice modes. So right now we're in January of year 103. So as we go forward through time, here we're in March right now, and at March we're at our maximum sea ice extent. So the ice anomalies are largest, and they're also at their most southerly extent at this point. And then as we go into the summer months, we're going to see the ice anomalies weaken, and they start to move northward. So now we're in September, which is the sea ice minima. And you can see that the ice anomalies have left the Bering Sea, they've left the Barents-Kara Sea for the most part, and they've also basically left the Labrador Sea as well. Now as we go into the fall, the ice starts growing southward, and you can see that the anomalies we had the previous spring get reproduced. So we get the positive anomaly back in the Bering Sea, the negative anomaly back in the Barents-Kara, and the positive back in the Labrador Sea. So these ice modes are reemerging. Okay, so now the interesting stuff comes when you start looking at the sea surface temperature plot. Okay, so here we're in March, which is the maximum sea ice extent month, and now what I want you to focus on is this little piece of the northern Bering Sea and this piece here, the Kara Sea. So in March, which is the maximum sea ice extent, those pieces of the Arctic are essentially anomaly free, or they have weak SST anomalies. But now as I go to the summer months, so April, May, June, July, August, you can see that the SST has been imprinted with a positive anomaly in the Kara Sea and also a negative anomaly in the northern part of the Bering Sea. And then as I move into the fall season, my ice starts growing southward. It interacts with that SST anomaly, and now I've wiped out my SST anomalies in these spots, but I've reproduced my ice anomalies. So it seems that the ice and SST family is reflecting that mechanism that I talked about earlier, where they trade off to reproduce the ice anomalies. Okay, so that's nice, but one thing that's not clear is that this mode family has a clear phase relationship between these different regions of the Arctic. So in particular, the Bering Sea is always out of phase with the Barents-Kara Sea, and it's always in phase with the Labrador Sea. And the SST anomalies are all local. So the SST anomalies provide a mechanism for, given an anomaly, why would the anomaly reemerge? Well, this SST mechanism is a candidate mechanism for why that would happen. But what the SST can explain is why these regions would be phase locked to one another. So how do you communicate the fact that I have a positive anomaly here to this guy here to achieve this phase locking? And it's probably not the ocean, because these basins are disconnected. So, but if you go to the atmosphere, if you look at the corresponding sea level pressure mode, so I'll just back this off to January. If you look at the corresponding sea level pressure mode, it's this Arctic dipole anomaly mode. So we have cyclonic winds around the low pressure and anticyclonic around the high pressure. So the winds are blowing from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific. So in particular, the winds are going to be blowing from the south and blowing warm air over the Barents-Kara Sea, which is going to do two things. It's going to melt additional ice thermodynamically. It's also going to push the ice edge further northward. Both those things are going to produce negative ice anomalies in the Barents-Kara Sea. Similarly, you have winds blowing from the pole over the Bering Sea, and those cold winds are going to act to freeze more ice and also push the ice edge further southward, both producing these positive anomalies we see in the Bering Sea. So it seems that the associated atmospheric pattern provides an explanation for why this phase locking might occur. Okay, and then if you can play a whole movie of this, and you see these families over time, they're kind of intermittent. So they turn on, they turn off, and their behavior is roughly characterized by the leading low frequency mode of ice, which I've plotted here. So the red dot shows the principal component value at each time. And so when that principal component is large, these families are all active, and they're all active in unison. So you can see reemergence events happening here, and then as we move up, now the principal component is flipped sign, and our reemergence events have also flipped sign. So it seems that this temporal pattern seems to govern this pattern of reemergence behavior between these three variables. Okay. So how am I doing on time, by the way? Quarter to?
Yeah.
10 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, so one thing we wanted to do was, instead of just looking at the movies and using the picture norm, we wanted to try to create some sort of way of quantitatively measuring these reemergence events. And so what we did is we created some reemergence metrics, we're calling them, which are basically time series that we can use to judge the phase and amplitude of reemergence events. So let's start with the sea ice. So for ice, the reemergence metric that we're going to use is you choose a region of interest R, and then you just look at the integrated sea ice anomalies over that region. So this gives you a time series, and these time series are plotted here in the top panel for the Bering, the Barents-Kara, and the Labrador seas. So if you look at, for example, the blue curve to start, you can see clear reemergence events in this metric. So for example, if you look around year 130 here, in blue you can see there's about a 4 or 5 year period where you see repeated events of positive ice anomalies in the blue time series. Similarly, around year 150, there's a big chunk of 8 or 9 years where you have consistently positive anomalies occurring in the Barents-Kara sea. And then at other points in the time series, the anomalies are much weaker and not nearly as persistent. So this metric kind of gives you a way of characterizing the temporal behavior. So the length of time the events persist for, also how strong they are, and then of course you can do it for different regions. So this plot really nicely shows the phase relationships between the different regions. So when I'm getting a positive reemergence event here in the Barents-Kara, I'm getting negative reemergence events in the Labrador and Bering Seas. Okay, and then for sea ice, the metric we looked at is the integrated SST anomalies over the region. And so if you look at, so you'd expect that during a period of active ice reemergence, you'd expect to see a similar oscillation in the SST, but with opposite sign. And that's exactly what we see here, is that the red and black curves are anti-correlated with one another, and so are the blue curves. So these curves seem to be, well, okay, so these curves right now are only illustrating the anti-correlation. If you zoom in a little bit further, which so I plotted 100 years here, you can't see it that well, but if you zoom in further, you can actually see that there's an interesting phase relationship between the ice and the SST metric, in that when the ice is positive, the SST metric is 0, and when the ice goes to 0, the SST metric hits its maximum value. So the metrics also exhibit this sort of trading off of anomalies that we see with the mechanism. So it's essentially just a kind of a cheap way of plotting the mechanism in 1D. And then the third metric we looked at was we took the SLP patterns, computed the geostrophic winds just using the SLP gradient, and then we took the maximum value of the meridional geostrophic winds, since it's the meridional winds that transport most of the temperature anomalies. So if you have positive meridional winds, you'd expect that you're blowing warm air over your region, so you'd expect negative ice anomalies. So, and we see that. So if you look at the red and black curve, when we have positive meridional winds, we see negative ice anomalies out of phase. And similarly, negative meridional winds, we see positive ice anomalies. So one thing to note here is that in the Bering and the Barents-Kara Sea, the Bering and the Labrador Sea, the SLP metric, it's maximum in winter, and then it turns off in the summer. So it has this annual periodicity to it. Whereas in the Barents-Kara Sea, our SLP mode doesn't have an annual decorrelation. So it just persists over the whole time series of the reemergence event. Okay. So I think maybe I'll skip this one. So moving to conclusions, what we found is that there's a set of NLSA mode families that seem to support the SST sea ice reemergence mechanism proposed by BW. And also, they've also revealed these interesting regional phase relationships between different regions of the Arctic, and those seem to be connected to the associated large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns. Also, I didn't get a chance to show it in this talk, but the observational families also have a qualitatively similar mechanism that happens between the sea ice and SST. And they also have a similar SLP teleconnection, but theirs is that the observations is actually associated with the Arctic oscillation instead of this dipole anomaly mode. And I should also mention that the second family of CCSM modes is associated with the Arctic oscillation, but that was the weaker reemergence family. So there's a definite difference there between the model and the observations in terms of the SLP mode it's picking up. So there's many qualitative similarities, but regional differences and also differences in the SLP. So in my ongoing and future work, what I've been looking into is trying to get more into the causality of this problem. All these modes show is interesting correlations between the different variables, but there's no notion of whether the atmosphere or the ocean is really driving the system. So I've been looking into Core 1 and Core 2, which are sort of like OMIP type experiments, forced with some fixed atmosphere, or specified atmosphere, I should say, and also at some slab ocean model runs, which sort of remove the effect of oceanic memory from the problem. And so I've been looking at these runs as sort of a hierarchy of different GCM runs to try to get a sense of the relative role of the atmosphere and ocean in this phenomenon. And I also plan to check this in some other GCMs. I'm working on that with the GFDL model right now, and also doing some other work involving trend detection using NLSA. So yes, thanks a lot for listening, and be happy to take any questions. Yep.
How sensitive are the results to different choices of Q for your spatial temporal?
Not very sensitive, actually. They're sensitive in the sense that Q needs to be, so the dominant piece of the signal is just the annual cycle. And if Q is less than 12 months, then you start breaking your annual cycle up between different modes, and then your results completely change.
Okay.
But I found I tested Qs anywhere from 12 to 60, and the results were pretty much the same, qualitatively anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the physical mechanism. Because you sort of discussed the relation between the ice and SFT, which is reasonable, and then the wind driven by the pressure that sort of leads to melting and stuff. But there must be a mechanism that maintains the pressure anomaly, because atmospheric pressure doesn't have that memory, so it has to be maintained by the ocean or the ice. So
Yeah.
you look into that?
I'm interested in that, and the short answer is I don't really have a good answer for that question. I definitely don't think that the atmosphere it's not intrinsic atmospheric memory which is producing the reemerging pattern of atmospheric anomalies. It's got to be coming from, I think, probably the ocean or maybe from sea ice anomalies. But there's been some studies that have showed that the ability of sea ice anomalies to actually force atmospheric circulation is not strong enough to explain like anomalies of this size, basically. So I think it's probably from oceanic memory would be my first guess, but I don't have a good answer for what the actual mechanism is, to be honest. And so the atmosphere it's so noisy that at any given time it's not even going to really look like this mode is the thing. What this mode really is it's kind of like it's sort of like a low pass filtered version of the real atmosphere. And this low pass filtering happens because of the data analysis algorithm that we've used. So it's a little
typical scale of for example, in ITPA or whatever. What's the typical scale of this?
I forget. So I had some color bars there. I forget what the numbers are, but I think it's something like 100 or 200 pascals. So 1 or 2 HPA. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you go back to the last slide?
This one here.
So in the first figure, so it's about like 150A. It says that it's phase relationship.
Right here, you mean?
Yeah. So what is it? What modulates the like longer time variation?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. So it's the family is built out of I didn't really explain it fully, but the family is built out of this low frequency mode and then 2 intermittent modes, one with annual frequency and one with semi-annual frequency. And it turns out that those intermittent modes are actually they are modulated by the low frequency mode. So what I would guess what like for example this feature or this feature here is a case where the low frequency mode passed through 0. And so it's low amplitude, and you also see the sign change directly after it. So I think this would be directly tied to the low frequency principal component changing sign, basically. And yeah. So like the decadal mode is just it's the low frequency ice mode we get, which actually looks a lot like the leading EOF of the model. But yeah, it's like a slow kind of decadal time series. Yeah. Yep.
So what would happen if you carry the same analysis without ice? I sometimes get that question. Do you get a completely different type SSTCL?
You do actually, yeah. So you don't you can't like the lag correlations that I showed, where I tried to sort of build the small family of modes that gave me the same lag correlations. If you don't use ice, so you can imagine basically doing the algorithm where I get time series from SST and SLP, and then just projecting those onto the ice variables, for example. If you do that, the you can't build a low-dimensional reemergence family.
So you can't really see how the ice actually affects here.
Yeah.
It's a curious question. So most people look at the FLT and SST relation. You sort of add ice into that. People sort of always guess ice as some whole story.
Yeah, and
But you can't really see that. I guess it's
and I guess like what I'm doing is like I'm training and I'm using all three variables, but what I'm doing is sort of biased in the sense that the way I'm choosing the modes is just based on ice. So it's kind of inherently biased. So you definitely if you take ice out, it does not work. One related point is actually if you take SLP out, it does work. So if you just train on ice and SST, you can essentially get the same results. Yeah. So the SLP doesn't seem essential for the training. Yep.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, my question will be for this case, specific case, you're using the NL as decompose. If you're just use SSA, what can we get?
So SSA has essentially the same periodic and low frequency modes.
Okay.
What's different is the intermittent modes. So the intermittent modes were the ones that sort of had the time, like the modulated time series. And in SSA, you get some modes that look sort of like that, but they don't have, their power spectra are not as clearly peaked about a certain frequency. And what that means is that when you start doing these lag correlations, you don't get, like, there's a nice kind of phase locking with these intermittent modes because they're tied to the annual and semi-annual cycles. So that means that every summer they turn off, and every fall they turn back on. Whereas with SSA, you don't have that periodicity in the mode, so therefore you can't reconstruct the same lag correlations efficiently. Right. So you can do it, but you just need more modes, basically.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of modes,
yeah.
The number of modes you're using.
Yeah.
What criteria for use in terms of number of modes you use?
Yeah.
We're going to use 16 or we're going to use 30.
Yeah. So for these results, I used 27 is the number.
I mean, what
yeah.
makes you choose
yeah.
27
So.
rather than 20?
So there's a kind of a heuristic criterion, which you can formulate in terms of relative entropy, but okay, so those details are kind of irrelevant. But the intuitive idea is that, like, if you look at the singular value spectrum from SSA, for example, you see that the spectrum, there's a decay, but certain modes, if you plot basically variance versus mode number, there's a decay, but also it tends to jump discretely at certain points. So we basically truncate at one of those jumps, typically. So, and what the jump you choose is actually up to the user of the algorithm. It's an open question, but we sort of use that as a rule of thumb, basically. Right. So I know from experience that it jumps every time you add a new low frequency mode into your mode spectrum. So usually I'll keep enough modes to keep maybe 3 low frequency modes, which happens to be somewhere usually 20 or 30, something like that. So, pardon me? It is case by case, definitely. Yeah, and I don't propose to have a full theory of that by any means, but it's just sort of a rule of thumb that we use. Yeah. Yep.
Can we look at the first slide you showed to motivate?
Oh, yeah.
Where you showed before, yes.
This one here?
No, where you showed this lag correlation, the first lag.
Right here.
Yeah.
Yep.
So for any of them, the peak that occurs is actually a very small value. Say for Mars, the second, what is the value of the correlation? Like 0.4.
Yeah, it's about 0.4.
And so I would posit that. So this actually explains only 16% of the variability. So actually, it is inherently unpredictable. Because it's a very small correlation, and that is why all the exercises in prediction actually work only when they log on to the linear trend. Otherwise, they don't have the predictability. So with a autocorrelation of 0.4, you can't predict it.
So I think that's true. But so one counter argument I would make is that these calculations, so these correlations are sort of a time mean over the whole time series. And what the metrics show you is actually that there's periods of time where the reemergence is more active and less active.
Yeah, but you can't predict them.
But you can because they're. Well, so I think you can because the the periods where it's active and inactive is modulated by some low frequency index. So for example, you could track, say, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, and then or something of that sort anyways. And if you can predict that index, then you can get a sense that you can predict the expected amplitude of reemergence events. And so there may be periods of time where it's active that you actually have a higher correlation than this 0.4. So there may be some predictability buried in there. But I agree, it's like this in general, 0.4 is a pretty small correlation in terms of variance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised in some observation study because you have this very large trend both in ice and as well as in SST or whatever other words.
Mm-hmm.
And so this pattern seems to be independent of all those stuff.
Yeah. So this is all done with detrended data.
Yeah, I understand, but
yeah.
presumably the trend will affect the kind of high frequency variation. But you kind of sort of argue that I know the model works, but
right.
in real world.
So so you're saying the fact that there actually is a background trend state could actually influence. Yeah, no, it's true.
How many years people actually have this data like that?
The CA satellite data is from 79 till now, so it's about 35 years. It's not bad, yeah.
It's kind of surprising, given the large changes for the Norwegian flow as well as the ice show. The background seems to have a big factor.
Yeah, so I think like the best idea I could think of was just detrending the data and assuming that you can sort of linearly separate them. But you're right that probably the background state actually does affect the full climate state, obviously.
Just to follow up on that, sort of especially for September when you have minimum CI, the initial sort of mean that the ice vary around in the early period and the mean that they vary around in the later period is sort of separate spatially. So you do see sort of a pattern emerge from the entire trend. So that even in a linear sense without any nonlinear interaction, one would sort of.
That's actually, I think you're saying the regions where the variability occurs is changing as a function of time.
It might change. Well, it's sort of. Just easy, one would think that since your mean ice is from the early period and the mean ice from the late period, that is separate so much that the variability actually occurs at first.
I definitely agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the one way we're getting around that is by doing this pattern correlation. You're always just local in time, so you're only looking, from your present time to 2 years in the future. So you're always sort of in the local state. You're never comparing 1979 to 2013, for example. So I think we get past that issue because of the pattern correlation approach. But I think if you use the full time series, then that would actually hurt you. Yeah.
If we have any more questions for the speaker, I invite you to come to lunch from there. And for everyone else, thank you for coming.
pattern will change. So